everybody, and welcome back to Beware the Artist. This week on the show, we have Bill Schmidt. Bill, how are you doing today?
I'm just fine.
If you want to go into it and tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do.
Sure. Just a brief bio. I grew up in New Jersey. I went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts as an undergraduate in Philly. And in 1969, I moved to Baltimore to go to grad school at the Maryland Institute College of Art, which back then was not MICA, it was the Institute. I think it's sort of interesting that both of the art schools I went to before they got acronymized. Is that a word? Because PAFA was the academy when I went there, and MICA was the institute. But anyway, I got my MFA from the Hoffberger School of Painting. I worked with Grace Hardigan for 2 years, so I got my MFA in 1971. And I did the part-time teaching circuit for roughly a decade out of grad school. I did have a non-tenure track 2-year appointment at UNBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And when that ended, I decided I didn't want to go back to the itinerant adjunct routine. And I kind of stumbled into a new trade. I learned how to gild on the job. I started working for a guy I knew in art school. And I did gold leaf restoration for almost 15 years, 14, 15 years, restoring picture frames and mirror frames and doing some architectural gilding. When I left that job, I went to work for a small furniture restoration company as a finish restorer. And basically, I was a French polisher for about 4 years. French polishing is a very old, shellac-based, labor-intensive furniture finishing method. It's a very beautiful way of finishing a piece of furniture. And around that time, I started teaching again part-time. I became the resident artist in the post-baccalaureate program at MICA, which is run by my friend Christine Neal. And just to cut this a little bit shorter, I was in that position for part-time for 5 years. And then I became the interim director when the founding director stepped down. I held that position for 18 years and retired a year and a half ago. I am also a musician, as you know, and I've been playing traditional American music of various kinds on fiddle, guitar, banjo. I also play the ukulele every now and then. And I've been doing this since I was a teenager, really. I started playing guitar when I was a kid and picked up banjo and fiddle in the early 70s. And it's been a very big part of my life for a very long time.
Great. So do you consider yourself mainly a painter?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even though I made sculpture for 20 years.
Yeah. I feel as though there is a very sculptural element to your work. I find that the abstractions, they have a sense of body to them, and there's always this, at least in the recent work, there's this kind of shape or figure or mass that starts to emerge from kind of the center of the compositions. Do you want to talk to what's happening there? What's going through your head?
Sure. I started doing these paintings, which I refer to as, it's kind of an iconic presentation, as you say, an image, shape, or configuration that sits in the center, very often a square, but sometimes a rectangle, a vertical rectangle. I've always been interested in shape. And one of my favorite things to do for years has been to invent shape for the sake of invention. I've got sketchbooks and flat file drawers full of drawings that where I've engaged in that process. And I had made a few tentative attempts to paint based on that idea. And I kind of felt that there wasn't enough there to kind of engage me and ultimately engage the viewer. But about 4.5 years ago, I decided, what the heck, I really want to make some these very simple pared down paintings. And one of the real impulse was that um, I, I wanted to exert more restraint in my work. That my MO, it seemed to me, for better or worse, and sometimes worse, was to start the painting simply and then just keep adding stuff until either it looked good or there was no more room to add anything else. And that's not a great strategy always. So you know, so that impulse to be more restrained and really pare down my means, along with sort of engaging in my love of shape, and basically make small, very simple paintings that are a portrait of a shape. And
Interesting.
then that broadened into portraits of little configurations and linear things, and so that sort of thread in my work was happening while I was making more, the more layered, complex paintings with a number of different characters, in the drama at hand.
The I feel as though your color choices, they're very meticulous. It's not impulsive. It feels very planned, very organized. How do you go about choosing these color combinations within the paintings?
They really very much develop as a part of the process. I'm using gouache. I'm using traditional gouache. So its water solubility is a given, and it is always water soluble. Um, and without really devising this as a strategy, I realized a while back. I've been painting in gouache for over 15 years now. Um, I tend to use color right out of the tube, and mixtures happen by virtue of how I layer the gouache
Mm.
and how I manipulate it. So there may be certain areas in any given painting that some of the linear work that I'm doing, let's say, is a color that is right out of the tube. But a lot of the other areas are the result of careful layering of washes of gouache one on top of the other, or scraping. I do a lot of removing of paint. It's a joke between my wife and myself. When I come home from a day at the studio, she'll say, "So how did it go?" And one answer is, "Well, I removed a week's worth of work today, or I took off more paint than I applied." So an answer to your question happens very indirectly, and I don't always have a clear strategy about color when I start out a painting. I have a starting point, and very often, you posted that sort of greenish painting that started out as a red painting. So that's it's not uncommon for that to happen.
Hmm.
And my initial impulse might be, I'm going to start out with green today and then see what happens. One thing I did notice, speaking of green, someone observed that in my studio, she said, "Boy, you sure like green, don't you?" "So do I." And I thought, "Well, yeah, these paintings are all green." And it really got me to think about how I work with color. And I realized that my sort of kind of default setting coloristically was, to work with blues and greens and cooler colors, and then to use warmer accents, yellows and oranges and reds and whatnot. So I deliberately then made a few paintings that sort of flip that, where they were largely warm reds, oranges, and yellows, uh, and then cools, blues, and greens maybe provided that accent. But after I made those paintings, I was right back to my default set for the most part.
I know in your process recently, you've been bringing in the tablet. How has that been helping you generate these paintings?
It's just become one of my most valuable tools. I got it, maybe 5 years ago. And my original thought was this would be just another sketchbook, that would allow me to draw, and would, because it's such a different beast than the sketch pad, the pencil, let's say, that I would likely come up with things that I wouldn't come up when working more traditionally. And I still do that occasionally. Um, but I would never really, I never intended to make. In other words, I knew that I couldn't make a painting in the tablet and then paint that in an
Mhm.
analog fashion. That would be a fool's errand, really. But it was just a way of generating ideas and configurations and stuff. Um, what became clear to me after a while was its value in helping me work through the process of making an individual painting was tremendous. And very often, what I will do, like often at the end of the day, a painting's in progress, I will photograph it in the tablet, take it home with me, and while I'm drinking my martini during cocktail hour with the wife, I can kind of tweak the thing and figure out what the next step is, and I do that in the studio too. And with the gouache, I get to a certain point in these paintings, and early on, I can splash around a fair amount, and things get painted out, they get lost and found and reestablished. Um, but once things kind of get pinned down and I'm liking where it's headed, I have to plot my moves pretty carefully. I just
Mhm.
can't go in half cocked and add something because at a certain point it gets to be an all or nothing proposition. If I screw up, it can be really hard to fix, and I may have to wipe the thing out and start all over again, which happens. I think you've seen evidence of that in my studio.
I feel
So
as yeah.
the tablet is a very, very important tool to me.
I feel like there's a certain luminosity to the tablet that might not translate to the physical realm within the painting, but yet at the same time, there's such a large area of vibration that happens in a lot of your work, and there is a kind of generating of luminosity happening through these layers within the panels.
Yeah, light is really important to me. And I mean, even though these are nominally abstract paintings, I started out as a still life painter, and an observational painter. And I was always interested. I remember, when I was at the academy, always just being really just obsessed with the way the world looked and how I could, capture that in some way. And of course, a big part of that is how light falls on form and, you know, what, just how that works and how it affects color and I think that's still a part of my work. That there are some of the linear details that are in my paintings are function as kind of as highlights in a sense and help create space. Now it's a very compressed space, but it's space nevertheless.
Your choice of scale, how does that factor into the work? Because I know your sculptures were a bit larger, and these paintings they tend to fall in a maybe around this size.
They're 8 by 8 are the little ones, 16 by 16. I do like squares, but I do paint some rectangles. Um, in part that has to do with my choice of medium. Gouache is a miniature medium.
Mm.
And it comes in little tubes, and I think it works best at a smaller scale. Although I know some artists have made bigger paintings. I think in addition to that, um, I've always been a bit of a miniaturist at heart. I think I do like working close. I was an avid model maker when I was a kid, and I spent a lot of time like you know this far away from a piece of balsa wood with an X-Acto knife in my hand, and and I've done very small, intimate work over the years, even though I've made big paintings and sort of, moderately large sculpture. But to me, there is something very powerful about a small, intimate work of art, a painting especially, um, that the way one engages with that, it's a one-on-one engagement. Viewer and not more than one person can really stand in front of a foot square painting and you know and engage with it. And I think that's very important to me. And there's something about that that process of working very close. I'm sometimes I've got to take my glasses off, and I'm this far away from the panel, and your world falls away. Sometimes when I'm working, my world is no bigger than that 1 square foot of panel in front of my face, and it's a mesmerizing process. And my hope is that the viewer will their experience will kind of mirror that when they approach the work and give themselves over to it. They are a foot away or a matter of inches away from it. And their world falls away too, and they enter into the space of that little painting.
I think one of my favorite kind of quotes, I don't remember who said it, but you start working in the studio and you're in there with everyone that you've ever interacted with, everyone you've ever spoken to, and then as you start to work, as you start to paint, they all start to leave the studio. And when you can finally get to that moment where it's just you in the studio, you're in that mode of making. And that's just so true to get lost in that moment of making. And I love that translation that you're trying to bring that to the viewer, to have them in that one-on-one moment.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that any work of art, I think at the very best, the experience of the viewer in some ways mirrors that of the person who made the work. That notion of voices in your head. A very wise person one time told me, we all have voices in our head that are speaking to us, but they're not all of them are giving us good advice. So
it's so true. So you first came to Baltimore in 1969,
Yeah.
and you've been here ever since. What was it like being an artist in Baltimore in the late 60s, early 70s?
Yeah, well, Baltimore was a much different place back then. I mean, I came to town pre-Harbor Place. So the scene was much smaller, obviously. Mica was tiny then compared to what it is now. There were just 2 grad programs at mica when I came in '69, Hoffberger and Reinhardt, the sculpture program. And I mean, there was a scene, and I think that for me, things really kind of took off. And I moved to Fells Point about a year out of grad school, and there was a sort of burgeoning artist bar kind of good time scene happening down there. And prior to that, the bars were pretty rough and tumble Siemens bars, and gradually they started being taken over by newcomers, and I lived about 2 blocks from the foot of South Broadway. I was there from I don't know, '72 until '78, '79, something like that. And boy, it was a great scene. It really was. I mean, there were a lot of artists down there. Bertha's had just opened up. That was a real hangout. Turkey Joe's, a number of other really, really great places. And there were artists all over the place. The old Fells Point Gallery, which was actually run by the Alumni Association of MICA, was a real focal point. I had my first one-man show there in the mid '70s.
Wow.
But and I've said this many times in conversations about the art scene in Baltimore. I never cease to be just blown away at how things have grown and what we have in this town right now. I mean, it is just fantastic. And even 20 years ago, 15 years ago, if you told me what things were going to be like today, and the number of galleries, really good artist-run galleries, and just great artists of every shape and size, it really it's exciting to be a part of it. It really, really is.
So would you say that was kind of a catalyst in keeping you here, just kind of seeing that scene start to grow and seeing the energy that was happening around it?
I think the catalyst that kept me here was a certain lack of ambition. um, you know, I I planted roots here, and made friends. And I know you want to talk a little bit more about my music, but in the I think it was in '76 or something like that, I was a founding member of an old time string band, and I played with those guys for I guess 7 or 8 years before I left the band. They can, and during that period, I was very much involved with music. We weren't a full time band, we were active and played festivals and made a couple recordings and even toured Europe. So that was just such an important part of my life that the notion of leaving that it just was not something I was really considering. And when I left the band, I just felt really, rooted to this place. And then I rejoined the band after being out of it for 15 years. They invited me back in, and I accepted the invitation. And we played for another couple of years after that. But I think that, I love this town. I absolutely love this town, warts and all. I mean, it is just such a great place, and the people here are terrific. And like I said, I mean, my friends are here.
How would you say, having these two creative outlets, you have your music and then you have your painting, do they ever cross kind of contaminate each other in a good way?
Yeah, contamination that does not suggest a desirable process. But I get the question. Um, you know, for years, I didn't give a lot of serious thought to the connections between these two things that I do. It just casually I think about them. Of course, they're related because it's the same guy doing both. Um, but I'd say about 15 years ago, a good buddy of mine, Dave Rice, who's an amazing harmonica player from Ohio, was looking at some of my paintings, and he said, "These look like our music." And it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, I might just want to think about this a little more and a little more deeply. And I have done that, over the ensuing decade and a half or so. I've looked at those two activities, every which way. One thing that has occurred to me is that I'm really lucky in that I have these two very different creative engagements, and which allows me a level of self-understanding. Because when I think about how I might play a fiddle tune, and I think of what I attend to when I'm learning that and trying to make that tune my own. And these are traditional tunes, so I'm not trying to reinvent the music. I'm very much occupying a very prescribed realm. But when I think about what it is that I pay attention to, I realize it's the same stuff I pay attention to when I'm making a painting. And for example, the notion of phrasing in music is real important. And basically, it's how the larger piece, the piece of music, is constructed of its various chunks, how those chunks relate to one another, what's the space between them, so on and so forth. I'm a phraser when I paint. I attend to the same kind of thing. When you're making any work of art, it's made up of its constituent parts, and how do they fit together? What's the relation of one part to the next? I'm also a detail person, and I think that's evident in my music. The music that I play, let's say, just concentrating on the old fiddle tunes, they're very complex, typically. And when you're playing in an ensemble, whether it could be just fiddle, banjo, guitar, the music is very dense. It's very layered, and I think in the best of those, those old performances, and hopefully my performances, there are all kinds of internal tensions in the music, and I was thinking about this the other day, that that notion of internal tension, thinking, and it's important to my work. I'm thinking about Hans Hofmann's push and pull, that creating space by virtue of color, variation, shape, and whatnot, but not in a kind of traditional pictorial way. But my paintings are very much about internal tensions, and establishing a kind of equilibrium pictorially. Um, well, you bow the fiddle with pushing and pulling, and the bowing of an old time fiddle tune is what creates rhythmic nuance and the heartbeat of the tune. And you know, again, I'm still thinking about these
Yeah,
connections,
yeah,
and because I knew you were going to ask me about that,
yeah.
it led to this other kind of like holy shit moment, that push and pull thing literally happens when you're playing the fiddle, and that's what creates those internal tensions
Hmm.
within a fiddle.
I love
Uh,
this idea of phrasing, that you're taking the phrasing from the music and you're seeing that connection within this work, which makes me think about how you might kind of organize and curate a solo show. Are you thinking about these things when you're kind of making a body of work? Are you thinking how they exist within a room together, or are they kind of independently subjugated in their own little world? But are they or are they part of a larger language that you're trying to grasp at?
well, I think both, really,
Hmm.
both. That I mean, even though I think you could argue that I am, working in series in a way. Actually, I have several. I mean, there are several subsets within my work. But I, I don't really. I think once the work is done, then I start thinking about how various paintings would work together. And
Hmm.
I had a show at Viz Arts down in Rockville, Maryland, last spring, which Viz Arts shut down the day that my show opened in the middle of March, when everything shut down. So really, no one got to see that show except virtually. But mounting the show was its own reward, and I wanted to show the simpler paintings, the iconic.
Hmm.
Um, I call them my one thing paintings, just as a way of identifying them. And of course, then there are the grids that I do that are sort of another subset within that group. But anyway, I decided I was just going to show those simpler paintings. But there were some real challenges in terms, because there is a range within that. That subset of work, that there were some paintings that just didn't make it in because I couldn't get them to work in that
Hmm.
group. And I got a lot of input from friends who visited the studio and kind of helped me make some choices about what would work and what might not work.
In the studio when you're working, what is the atmosphere? Do you have music playing? Do you have podcasts on? What's happening in your studio when you make?
Yeah, I know a lot of do audiobooks and podcasts and stuff. I don't do that. It's music or talk radio usually. I was talking to a painter from New York a couple of years ago. We were both musing about, you know, how many paintings were made to the sound of Terry Gross's voice on Fresh Air. Um, but I listen to music a lot, and I tend not too much to listen to the music that I play, because
Mm.
I find it can be a distraction. I'll hear a piece of music and say, "Oh, I always wanted to learn that," or "What's the name of that?" But I listen to a lot of jazz, blues, rock and roll. I'm pretty eclectic in my taste. I've always been a Thelonious Monk fan, and I guess 5, 6 years ago, a guy saw my painting and didn't know anything about me at all. I says, I think of Thelonious Monk when I see these paintings. That's probably the best compliment I have ever gotten about my work. So of course that upped my Thelonious Monk listening. I went out and bought a couple of box sets. So I probably listened to Monk more than anything else in the studio.
I remember when I was in grad school, I was talking to my professor during a studio visit about kind of the music that he has in his studio, the music that I have playing in my studio, and then I was telling him kind of my like upbringing, where I'm from, and he's like, "It sounds like you just fell out of a Bruce Springsteen album," and I kind of I took that as a bit of a compliment. Um, so being that you are a musician and you are a painter, what are some of your kind of what are your go-to artists to listen to outside of the studio, and what are your go-to painters to look at outside of the studio?
Hmm. Um, well, I mean, musically, when I'm not in the studio, I'm listening to a lot of archival recordings, field recordings of old fiddlers and banjo players and singers, and the golden age of recorded old time music, and that's what I play. It's called old time music. That sounds really generic, but that is in fact what it's called. Um, the golden age of recorded old time music was from early 20s, 1924, until the Depression hit, which killed that industry. But people were recorded on 78 RPM records, and there are a multitude of old recordings, and a lot of these have been reissued. They're widely available now. So I listen to a lot of that, and of course, my contemporaries, younger bands who are playing this music. I do listen to a lot of blues. I finger pick the guitar. I'm a huge Mississippi John Hurt fan, so he's always a go-to. With regard to artists, I mean, there are so many people who I look at, and I tend to. I was thinking about this because I figured you'd probably ask me this question. That a lot of, let's say, painting that I like, I like it maybe because it shares a certain sensibility with my own work, um, but mostly just because looking at the work gives me pleasure for some reason. Um, that I don't have big philosophical reasons. I like a lot of representational painters. Bob Bechtel, the photorealist who died not all that long ago, has always been a favorite painter of mine. And I think, in a way, his sort of exacting sensibility and his paintings were, I would say, deeply considered, and that's a quality that I really respond to. I sort of see, him attending to certain things that I attend to in my work, even though the work's highly different. Speaking of artists, we've lost Tom Leskowski, just a great abstract painter, great painter. It's been a favorite of mine for a long time. Back when I was making sculpture and still, Martin Puryear, I think, is a tremendous artist. These are some people who come to mind. But you ask me who I look at when I'm not in the studio. I'm gonna talk about who I'm looking at in the studio these days, because I cleaned out my desk and found a bunch of postcards of paintings that I've collected over the years, and a few favorites. And I happen to have one of them right here. And I don't know how this will will read. You can kind of you can see that.
Yeah.
It is an amazing painting. It's the Ghirlandaio's portrait of, I never get the name right, Giovanna Tornabuoni. And, this is a lousy reproduction, but I have seen this painting in person. My wife and I were in Spain, oh gosh, I forget how many years ago, and there's a show at the Prado of Renaissance portraiture. And that painting was in the show. And it's an absolutely phenomenal painting. And the I don't know how well it will come across, but there is a world in the sleeve of her garment there. It is just this amazing. Uh, it leaves me speechless. And another thing I thought of in looking at this painting, that Jim Nutt's paintings of women. I don't know if you're familiar. The Chicago
Hmm.
Harry Who Images painter. His later paintings I'm a big fan of it, and he seems to owe a debt to this Ghirlandaio painting. I wouldn't be surprised if this is a very favorite painting of his, because I see the connection
When I was
there.
when I was studying in Florence, I had kind of a mind blowing experience. I hated Pontormo. I hated his sense of weight, scale, everything happening in his paintings. I didn't get it. didn't get it at all. And then I was studying art history while I was in Florence and went and saw one of his paintings in person, and it changed my perspective of his work completely. The shot silk, the sense of gravity that you're feeling when you kind of look at these works, and you just start to float through the air with these figures that feel as though they have no sense of gravity. I feel that there's such a disconnect in our world with actually seeing productions of art online versus actually witnessing them, and so many of people today take that as face value. Just experiencing things online and not experiencing art in person. Would you like to talk to that at all in terms of
Uh,
experience?
yeah, yeah. Obviously that there are things that you don't get, that you don't see, that you don't feel, when you're looking at a digital image. And let's just talk about painting. And, surface and scale are two obvious ones. But I heard someone talking about this issue. I guess it was after the pandemic started, and people were really not looking at art in person. And the notion. I mean, if you think about how you engage with a painting, okay, you walk into a gallery or a room in a museum, and you see that work from a distance, and as you gradually approach it, your understanding of that work changes and grows. And I mean, to me, it's very exciting to you form a notion about a work when you see it from across the room. You get information, and as you get closer, you're verifying that that immediate understanding. And when you get within a foot or even inches of the work, I find it really exciting when you have to totally rethink your understanding of the work. That there are surprises there, or there may be something about the way it was painted which is totally counterintuitive, or just runs totally counter to your impression of the painting from across the room. So the way that you approach the work, I think, to me, is real exciting, and that you can't do that, with a digital image. It's there. It is. I mean, you could hold the screen away and move it in, but that would not be the same thing at all.
So you've spent many years as a professor and educator, as well as an artist and musician. If you had to give some advice to a future group of creatives that are coming up in the world, what would your advice be?
Well, I think that probably the biggest general bit of advice I could give would be, don't lose sight of those core values, interests, those things that made you want to put a mark on a piece of paper, or pick up a paintbrush, or make a piece of sculpture in the first place. Who are you? I mean, your job as an artist is to make the work that only you could make. And it might be the work that only you would want to make, but that's kind of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that art school, for all its value, and with the best intentions of faculty, I think that we tend to throw so much information at students that they can really lose sight of those, that core within them. And I would send my post-bac students off to grad school and say a little prayer, like, please don't mess them up too bad. Hopefully it won't take them a decade to recover from grad school. And I think by that I meant was that they will lose sight of, again, those core impulses, the things that make you you, and make you want to go back to the studio every day and keep doing this. How do you do that? Sometimes you have to ignore what people are telling you. You have to be, you have to. There has to be a healthy level of skepticism, I think. That don't buy everything that's being sold. Give it a run, try it out. You need to be open, but Lord knows. I mean, you've got 2 degrees in art. You can't listen to everybody to the same extent.
Yeah, that's a lesson that took me. It took me a little bit to actually figure out. There have been several instances, especially in the years after grad school, where I was bouncing around with all these voices in my head and not really following my true kind of path. So I wish I would have had this conversation with you X amount of years ago when I started grad school, to keep that in mind as I went through the
Yeah.
meat grinder.
Well, I mean, I can hand out this advice, but putting advice into play isn't always the easiest thing to do. And I think related to this, I was thinking also about when I studied with Grace Harding, and people had asked me over the years, so what did you learn from Grace? What did she teach you? And Grace was not a conventional teacher; it was grad school, and you're not really taught in grad school. But it took me a while to realize that what I got from Grace was this idea that so you want to be an artist? Well, it is you are choosing a life. You are
Mm.
choosing a life, and she certainly chose a life. And she modeled that, she demonstrated that, and I think that was it just that was the one big thing. Like this is a lifelong commitment. This that you are choosing a life.
That's so true. That's so true. And I think that's kind of the perfect note to end on. Um, so Bill, thank you so much for being on the show this week. If someone's looking for your work, where can they find it?
Unfortunately, I don't have an active website right now. Instagram, I put up not all of my work, but a lot of it pretty regularly. The Baker Artist Award site sort of functions as a kind of quasi website for me. So if people want to go Baker Artist Awards and do a search for Bill Schmidt, they would see several years worth of work, and I think that will probably be updated when the time
Great.
comes.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure for me. And everyone, make sure you tune in next week for our next episode. All right. See ya.
Thanks a lot. It's been great.